Today, I wanted to talk about this way of life that we live. Yeah, we have God's Spirit, or we're being moved by God's Spirit, and it works in a way where it opens up our mind in a way that we think, the things that we can understand, which is a miracle in itself when you really look at it.
Amen.
Everybody is looking for something grandiose.
Mm-hmm.
They want to see the dead live. They want to see the lame walk. We don't use lame, so that wouldn't even be quite a miracle, would it? They want to see a dude that couldn't walk before get up and walk. They want to see people that were blind be able to see. They want to see miracles.
Yes.
And that doesn't really seem to take place anymore, so we think. And my point is, having your mind opened up, that's a miracle in itself.
Amen.
Because if you try to take what you understand and explain it to somebody next to you, they look at you like you're crazy. That's the high point, having your mind opened up, but other people can't do the same. They don't get it. That is a miracle. Because it'll be as plain as day to you. And you'll break it down to your family and your friends. Doesn't compute. And that's a miracle. Nevertheless, so we have this understanding, we have this way of thinking, and God's truth, God's way of life, it seems so simple. Like, how can anyone else not understand it? How did I not see this before? Everything just seems like it's so plain and it makes complete sense. And it isn't that hard to comprehend. And that's because we have the benefit of God's Spirit.
Yes,
but
sir.
indeed, it really does seem simple. We turn to Matthew chapter 11, and we see how this simplification kind of comes out. Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. What have I got here? I believe this is from the New King James. If it's not, there are occasions where I'm using mostly from the New Living Translation. Then Jesus said, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens." So we're breaking into the context as it stands. Christ is talking to his audience. As he's talking to his audience, he begins to criticize the cities that he had been to, where they didn't really give him much clout. They weren't following what he was saying. They didn't recognize his authority. Christ is criticizing those cities, those areas, those people that couldn't really take what he was saying. Instead, what they did jive with were the religious leaders. They followed what the religious leaders were saying. And the religious leaders had a whole bunch of other rules and regulations that were attached to their sense of how to approach God that was not necessarily biblical. And this is what Christ is saying when he's talking about those who are weary and carrying heavy burdens. He's referring to that. Typically, you hear this verse, and people glean from it, oh, if you got problems, it is going to be okay. Which isn't necessarily wrong. However, not too many people use the verse in the context of what's happening. I just happen to be using the verse in the context in which it was said. So, here Christ is telling them, do it my way. Come over here. You've been dealing with the Whopper, taste the Big Mac. Try the other version, which essentially what was happening at that time. He was giving another perspective to religion. He didn't graduate from their schools. He didn't have any degrees. He wasn't ordained by their groups, and so he was kind of working against what they were doing. But yet, he seemed to have some following. So here he's saying, try things my way. Continuing on, take my yoke upon you. The yoke was something that was customarily put on the animal, a horse, an ox, when they were pulling a heavy burden. So the plow, if you had a backyard and you plant, it's rough just trying to dig up the ground.
Yes, sir.
You forget digging up the ground, just raking up leaves in front of a building. That could be enough in itself, that energy. He's like, I'm ready to go. So imagine trying to unearth the ground. And that's why they use these animals, these beasts of burdens, to pull these large plows and heavy machinery. So Christ is saying, take this yoke, this symbolically, this burden upon you, whatever it is that he would ask of you. Try it his way, to his degree, rather than what the religious authorities were doing. They wanted you to wash your hands up to the elbow before you ate. And there's nothing wrong with that, per se. But they connotated that as righteousness. They figured if you didn't do that, then you weren't obeying God, and you were hindering your pathway to God. Imagine if you had a child, a nephew and niece sitting at the table, and they're ready to eat lunch. Sometime, I remember being a kid, you're just ready to bust it down real quick. And you tell them, whoa, go wash your hands. And they quote scripture to you like that. It would scare the heck out of you, but you'd probably be so happy that they did such a thing, right? But that's not the case here. It's not about washing hands. It's not about all those rules and regulations. And Christ was saying his version, his yoke, what he would ask of, it doesn't include all of that stuff that would make it so you'll be able to have a pathway to God the Father, which is what the religious authorities were obstructing by all of their rules and regulations. Christ continues, let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. In comparison, the religious leaders, they were really after clout. They wanted control for control's sake. They wanted to be the one in charge. They wanted to be the top dog. Christ continues further, for my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light.
Yes, sir.
So again, this is an exemplification of the simplicity of following God. It just seems simple. But at the same time, it can also be complex.
Yes.
When we turn to 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 10, we see how the prophets in the past were trying to understand how things were going to play out. This salvation, I'm reading from 1 Peter verse 10, this salvation was something even the prophets wanted to know more about when they prophesied about this gracious salvation prepared for you. Prepared for you meaning, as Peter is talking to his audience, the churches that would have been reading this letter as it circulated. They wondered what time or situation the Spirit of Christ within them was talking about when he told them in advance about Christ's suffering and his great glory afterward. So this here is referring to Christ's Spirit, meaning the Spirit that God would use to work in man, to understand things. Continuing in verse 12, they were told that their messages were not for themselves, but for you, meaning the readers of the letters and present day moving beyond. And now this good news has been announced to you by those who preached in the power of the Holy Spirit sent from heaven. And then, reading from the New King James, or the way the New King James would word it, Peter refers that these are things which angels desire to look into.
Yes.
So even angels were intrigued about how this process would play out.
Amen.
There was a complexity behind it that raised their eyebrow. So on the one hand, understanding things of God and what God would have us do, what he would require of us seems so simple. And on the other hand, it could seem so complicated.
Okay.
Complicated when you have to put it into play. Complicated when you have to put it into practice. And it doesn't make it any easier that the guy next to you, the woman next to you, usually at your house, your family, your friends, they seem to make it challenging to put this into play, because that's when it really comes out. They say familiarity is what really does it. The people at home see who you really are. You could dress it up when you come outside, and you could look all nice and spiffy, but at home, they see what you're really like. And that's what matters. That's what you're supposed to bring out. That's the whole practice of living God's way of life. And yet that seems to be the hardest. So what on the one hand seems so simple, now becomes so complex. We are all tasked with having to obey God. And in so doing, we do have that balance of simple and complex. An example of one of the many instances where people are asked to obey God in the Bible is the story of Jonah. And we could turn to Jonah chapter 1. In chapter 1, starting in verse 1. The Lord gave this message to Jonah, son of Amittai. Get up and go to the great city of Nineveh. Announce my judgment against it, because I have seen how wicked its people are. So Nineveh at that time was a giant city, much like New York. If you were to start at the lower end of New York, down where the World Trade Center is, and go all the way up to Harlem, it's that kind of distance, which is what Nineveh was at the time. Very large city. Metropolis. The Ninevites, or the Assyrians, Nineveh was in Assyria, they were cruel people when it came to warfare. They really tortured their prisoners. They really tortured the people they engaged with in war. Not to mention all the other things that were a part of their culture and the society that were not reflective of God. Jonah gets this instruction, and his response was, no, I'm not doing that. I'm not. You're ever at work, and there's always that one individual that's outspoken. When they're told to do something, no, I'm not doing that. It's not in my job description. And the supervisor doesn't really even push it, because they know that's the way that person is. You're not going to get anywhere. This essentially is what Jonah was doing. I'm not doing that. How many times do we do that in our personal lives? When we're dealing with this balance of simple and complex, somewhere in the middle of simple and complex, we are brought to a point where we are asked to do something. And it's one thing to do something on the outside externally, which Jonah was having a problem doing just from jump. Externally, he was told to do something. On the surface, appearance-wise, go here, do this, do that. He had a problem doing that. As you continue to read the book, it became evident the bigger problem was his internal process of what he had to do, and the mentality that he needed to have to do it and continue functioning side by side with God thereafter. That's the part that was the problem. When we encounter that in the relationships that we have and the problems that we have, that's when we get, I'm not doing that. Maybe whatever circumstance you have encountered isn't your fault. Maybe it truly is the other person. They're smug. They're ignorant, cold, unfeeling, insensitive. Who knows what the problem may have been? However, that doesn't indemnify you from whatever changes you need to make. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to go out your way if the other person is totally out of bounds. But even in those situations, there's still something required of you, particularly in how you relate to God. That there's a change in how you must think. Because you could definitely take this the wrong way and it'll send you somewhere else. Bitterness and such could set in. You could have a completely different attitude from the way you respond to things. You have to process this the way Jonah had to process it when it was brought to him. In dealing with your relationships, your children, your families, your husbands, your wives, people at work, the guy on the train that's too close to you, or the person driving beside you that, for whatever reason, doesn't have the greatest skill set in driving. You are now forced to take on a certain attitude, and it seems to be hardest to do with the people close to you, and you find yourself going outwardly, subconsciously, I'm not doing that. In Jonah's case, he had reason. Some may have thought good reason, because he understood how the Ninevites were, how the Assyrians were. He also had his contemporaries, Amos and Hosea, who prophesied what would happen in the future. Not just what would happen in the future to the northern tribe of Israel, that upper country, but what the Assyrians would do to them.
Yes.
So all the more reason for him to go, I'm not doing it. And he broke out. He left in the opposite direction of where he was supposed to go.
Sure.
Continuing on, but Jonah got up and went in the opposite direction to get away from the Lord. if that is even possible. But he did go in the opposite direction because he felt so strongly, we're not doing this. Now, towards the end of the book, there seems to be not much of a resolution, but Jonah did have to come to terms with what he was tasked with and the internal process. He finally did complete the external. He did complete the appearance part, where he showed up where he was told to at his work site. He got on post, and he began to speak to the Ninevites the way he was instructed. But that's not the hardest part. That was not the completeness of the obedience to God that was required. It was the internal part that was necessary.
Yes, sir.
So, as the story plays out, the Ninevites, they changed. It was preached to them that their city was going to experience destruction if they did not change from some of the things they were doing. Now, that's not hard for the Ninevites to comprehend. They had their own problems at the time. There was another army nearby that they were having conflict with. They could have very well, at this point, lost. This is perhaps 100 years or so before they became that great power that would attack Israel. And this army was about 100 miles away. So to their mind, they're like, maybe things are going to really get bad in 40 days if we don't change. Nevertheless, they did change. That doesn't necessarily mean they started keeping the Feast of Tabernacles. And you know they didn't. But they changed enough that they recognized God to a degree such that God did not destroy them. They changed from a lot of the negative things they were doing that weren't appropriate to the time and place, the schedule of how man is to live and how bad society is to get. They did change. So, when we see in Jonah chapter 3 and verse 10, when God saw what they had done and how they had put a stop to their evil ways, he changed his mind and did not carry out the destruction he had threatened. Continuing in chapter 4, this change of plans greatly upset Jonah, and he became very angry. So he complained to the Lord about it. Didn't I say before I left home that you would do this, Lord? Meaning, I knew how this was going to turn out. I knew how you were going to act. That is why I ran away to Tarshish. I knew that you are a merciful and compassionate God, slow to get angry and filled with unfailing love. You were eager to turn back from destroying people. His attitude as it went on was, I didn't want to be a part of that. I knew how you were going to act. I knew you weren't going to follow through. It would have been a waste of my time to go there and talk stuff, and they would have changed and you would have listened. As the story went on, God attempted to try to get Jonah to understand that the internal process was something that he had to really go forward with. Jonah thought perhaps maybe God was going to change his mind, destroy the city anyway. And he went and sat in a certain place where his vantage point was such that he could see the area and hoped that God would still destroy the city. In the course of doing that, the heat and the sun was such that it was beating down on Jonah and it was uncomfortable, but he had such a good seat, he wasn't trying to give it up. And a plant miraculously grows real quick and shades him. It's interesting to see how when you read the Bible and you read these accounts of the prophets interacting with God, how they don't seem to react to the things that we think they would react to. You read about how the prophets interact with God, and you would think in the middle of the night they would get so scared that somebody was talking to them in the dark. And they're like, yes, Lord. These weird things seem to happen, and they just go along with it like it's normal to them. So here Jonah is sitting, waiting to see the city destroyed, and this giant plant grows, and it shades him from the sun. And Jonah's response is, cool. All right, cool, this is I like this. And yet, when that plant miraculously disappears immediately within a day, now Jonah is annoyed. And then God questions him, how can you be mad about a plant when there are 120,000 children in the city that you were sitting there to watch get killed? And the book ends that way, leaving us to assume that Jonah continued on with this process, the internal process of trying to understand what is necessary when we obey God. That it's more than just on the surface.
Amen.
That it's more than just appearances. That it's the internal that matters, and that seems to be so complex, so complicated when your emotions are involved. In the same way Jonah had his emergency brake on, and he's trying to move forward. You can't do this and drag your feet. Another example of having to obey God, you can find in Acts chapter 9. Acts chapter 9 and verse 10. Here we find essentially the same situation. A follower of God, much the same way Jonah was asked to do something that goes against the grain of how one feels. So on the surface, that's one issue which Jonah had a difficulty in doing. Just following something on the surface, but internally, that's another plateau that causes difficulty, where things seem to get so complex. Acts chapter 9, verse 10. Now there was a believer in Damascus named Ananias. The Lord spoke to him in a vision, calling, Ananias. Yes, Lord, he replied. The Lord said, go over to Straight Street to the house of Judas. When you get there, ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul. He is praying to me right now. I have shown him a vision of a man named Ananias coming in and laying hands on him so he can see again. Explaining what is happening, Paul, or Saul, before his name was changed, was a part of the religious leaders group. He was one of the Pharisees, and he was very ardent about it. He was very adamant. He was militant. And he was going in people's homes and dragging people out by their hair if they were followers of God, and were not aligning themselves with the way the religious leaders of the day saw fit to behave and live. That talk of Jesus Christ and things like that, that'll get you thrown in jail. And that's what Paul was doing, or rather Saul at the time. More than that, I mean, he was getting people killed. It was more than just taking people and locking them up, getting your car booted. People were being put to death over this by what he was doing.
Sure.
So this is what happens. He's on his way on another campaign to go grab up some more people that are involved in the way, or as they would come to be known later as Christians. And in the process of doing, he is encountered by Christ in a kind of supernatural form, where a strong beam of light encounters him on the road. He falls off his horse. He can't see anymore. And he's talking to someone and no one else sees anybody. And this person identifies themselves as Christ. And he's told to go to a certain area and wait for instructions. This is when Ananias is approached by God. To go confront Paul and carry out some further instructions. At this point, we're at the same point in time that Jonah was at. God approached Jonah, told Jonah to go to the Ninevites, and Jonah was like, yeah, I'm not doing that. He now approaches Ananias, and he gets, quite honestly, initially the same response. So here we have in verse 11, go over the Straight Street to the house of Judas, ask for Saul. Dropping down to verse 13, Ananias' response, but Lord, but. Ananias' response, whoa, not so fast. What are you doing? Wait a minute. God, hold up. And he continues to explain his point of view. The same way Jonah's point of view was, these Ninevites, they're not cool. I know what's going to happen in the future, and I know how you act. I really don't want to be a part of this. I know you're going to forgive me. Here, Ananias is beginning to do the very same thing. But Lord, exclaimed Ananias, I've heard many people talk about the terrible things this man has done to the believers in Jerusalem. And he is authorized by the leading priests to arrest everyone who calls upon your name. But the Lord said, Go, for Saul is my chosen instrument to take my message to the Gentiles and to the kings, as well as to the people of Israel. And I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake. As the story plays out, Ananias did not run in the opposite direction the way Jonah did. Ananias went to the spot that he was told to go to. He fulfilled the appearance part. But the internal part, he also had to fulfill. To deal with a man that has been killing your comrades, your brothers and sisters, your family, he had to swallow that and deal with that and process that, using God's Spirit to have that mindset that God would have us have in our personal interactions. He had to go through with that. He had to follow through with that complex part. And in verse 17, we get the fulfillment of what Ananias had to do. So Ananias went, breaking in the middle of the sentence. That's what he did. He went, unlike Jonah, who ran. Ananias went. Unlike Jonah, who had a problem towards the end of the book processing what was needed of him internally, Ananias was able to do that because he spent a good deal of time with Saul after this. And that takes effort. And that's the effort that we have to have when we're at home, when we're fighting with our family, when we're dealing with our coworkers, when we're dealing with people at church. This is not easy.
Amen.
It seems so simple. Where in the world did it become complex? Matthew 21, we find again this struggle with simple and complexity. Matthew 21, verse 28. Christ poses a question to the people that he's talking to. And as usual, he seems to be arguing with the religious authorities. But what do you think? A man had 2 sons, and he came to the first and said, Son, go work today in my vineyard. The son answered. He answered and said, I will not. In the complete Jewish Bible, the son answers and says, I don't want to. This is the attitude that oftentimes we could give God when it comes to the internal part, not the external part. So that seems to be the easy part for some. To show up to church, to get, spiffed up, to put on the tie, put on your dress, do your hair, go act religious, listen to nice music that day.
Yes.
So instead of Hot 97, you may pull up that gospel and listen to that because you're a good person today. And the challenge is more than that.
Yes, sir.
The challenge is on the inside.
Amen.
Continuing on in verse 29, he answered and said, I will not. But afterward he regretted it and went. Then he came to the second son, and said likewise, instructed the son to go into the vineyard and work. Here in this parable, God is asking his children, his followers, to obey whatever that obedience would entail. Whether it's the Sabbath, the holy days, whether it's pork, don't put pepperoni on your pizza. Again, some of these things can be challenging when you are immersed in that culture. And there is a good deal of effort to retract yourself from that. Granted. But even still, after a while, and sometimes after years of not living that way, there seems to be an ease to it. And it's not part of your everyday circle or lifestyle. And yet, some people may feel that's all that's necessary. Once you do that, well, you're good if you understand the quote-unquote truth. If you know that Saturday is the real Sabbath kept by those in the Bible and not Sunday, then, well, you're already there. And that's not true. That's the appearance part. But there's another part, the internal part.
That's right.
That's required of us.
Amen.
And that's the part people seem to overlook. Then he came to the second and said likewise, and he answered and said, I go, sir. They talk a good game. Of course, I'll do that. So many times when people are religious and they refer to God, they love Jesus. They tell you, I love Jesus with all my heart. Oh, and then they start singing, what? and don't let them sound good.
Yes.
And you're sitting there like, wow, I really love Jesus. But that's external. The internal part is something of the challenge of how to think and live when you go home. That's a whole other thing. And they falter like everybody else, in spite of how much they love Jesus. Even though, according to the definitions of the Bible, true love is following God's commandments.
Yes, sir.
And you follow through, that love needs to be divvied up in a certain way, displayed in a certain way. And that's where you still find yourself funneled back into the Sabbath and the holy days and those things. But I'm saying you don't stop there.
Mm-hmm.
And he answered and said, I go, sir, but he did not go.
Mm-hmm.
Now Christ poses the question, which of the two did the will of his Father? Basically saying, is it the one that sounded good, that had all the good game? Or you have the other one that didn't sound good. They didn't even look like they were going to do what they were supposed to. They're not even acting right. They don't behave. In this parable, those people, those were the tax collectors.
Yeah.
Those were the prostitutes.
Yeah.
Those were all the people doing everything wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And initially, like, yeah, I'm not doing that. But they changed. They
Mhm.
repented. They
Yes.
lived differently.
Amen.
But the other group that sounded good, on the inside, they didn't change. They could just sound good. Those other people on the outside, it didn't look all that spectacular.
Mhm.
But on the inside, they were convicted and they changed.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Even amongst ourselves, we look at each other and we go, well, my kids don't act like that. I don't behave that way. I don't think this way. I don't carry myself that way. My relationships are different. I don't have that problem. And when you're doing that, it's focusing on the exterior and not the inward part. You may or may not have those problems, but you're called on the inside to make changes. Even if you don't have those problems, there's something else that you're going to have to change about what you're doing. And if you do that, if everyone does that, then what happens is everyone would change rather than pointing the finger at someone else and looking at someone else's situation. By looking at someone else's situation to determine whether we change or not is stalling.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
That's how you go, yeah, I'm not doing that. And you run away. That's stalling in your obedience. You'll never make the changes you need to
Amen.
if you just focus on appearances.
Yeah.
Matthew chapter 23, verse 23, Christ attacks people that would just focus on appearances. What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees? Hypocrites, for you are careful to tithe even the tiniest income from your herb gardens, but you ignore the more important aspects of the law: justice, mercy, and faith.
Yes.
Here we find a lot of the religious leaders and the Pharisees. They were intent on displaying a certain degree of obedience on the outside, but internally they couldn't make that change. And they focused on things to such a degree that it seemed ridiculous, the things they would focus on, all the while what was really important, the internal part, wasn't getting done. So here we find Christ saying that they're careful to tithe the little smallest income. Any little bit of money they got, they were focused on trying to tithe, which is something that you should be doing.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yes.
they focused so hard on that, and that alone, that their attitude was, because I did this, I'm good, I don't have to do anything else. Because I did this, I look like I'm good money, that I don't have problems, that I'm good with God. But internally, they didn't change. Internally, are they going home, praying, and studying, and fasting, applying, living God's way in the way they behave and think, and then repeating that process on a daily basis? That's what we are all tasked to do.
Yes. Amen. Yes.
Amen.
If you're not doing that,
Amen.
and focusing on, well, I tithe, I keep the Sabbath, I do this, I do that, I don't eat pork, I watch religious programming, I sing religious songs, I say hallelujah. That's not enough. It's fine if you do,
Amen.
but that's not enough. Christ continues, you should tithe, yes,
Yes.
but do not neglect the more important things.
Yes, sir.
Blind guides, you strain your water so you won't accidentally swallow a gnat.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not to eat unclean meats, unclean animals.
Mm-hmm.
The Pharisees would go so far as to strain the water to make sure if there was a bug in it, they would get the bug out so they don't break that law. And so they could look like they're obeying God.
Yes.
And they're so devout. But internally, are they praying, studying, fasting, applying God's way of life and the way they think and live and repeating this process?
Mm.
And are we doing that?
Mhm.
If you just focus on the external, then you're nowhere close to where you're supposed to be.
Amen.
Mhm.
Instead, they strain out the gnat, Christ continues, but you swallow a camel, meaning you're creating an even bigger problem by ignoring the internal part. Church is more than just coming here looking fashionable.
Amen.
Obedience does not start when you get to church.
Amen.
Obedience doesn't start when you get home on your Sabbath and you start playing religious music.
Amen.
Obedience doesn't start on Monday morning when you get in a car and you're driving to work and you say a few words to God.
Mm.
Obedience doesn't start when you read that daily devotional scripture to
Amen.
make yourself feel good.
Yes, sir.
Obedience doesn't start then. Obedience starts and continues on a 24-hour cycle, inclusive of all the other things I just mentioned. And we all so often forget that because that's the part that's harder to do.
Mhm.
That's the complex part. Christ continues in verse 25. What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are so careful to clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you are filthy, full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first wash the inside of the cup and the dish, and then the outside will become clean too.
Yes, sir.
We are fixated on our outside,
Yes.
on how we look on the outside. But on the inside is something else. Other people can't see the inside.
Mhm.
Sometimes people interpret what the inside is from the outside. And again, still misguided, still off. No, we all should, instead of looking at what's on the other person, figuratively looking at their dish, their cup, we should be looking on the inside of our cup.
Amen.
Mhm.
And that's really hard to do.
Yes, sir.
How many of us will leave here today and go home and get in an argument with whoever's at home waiting for us?
Mhm.
How many will do it on the way home in the car
Mhm.
with the person next to you?
Yes.
How many will do it on the phone? It's hard, that way of thinking that we must live. It's constantly there. That challenge is continuously there of how we must change. Maybe it isn't even a person where your greatest struggle is. Maybe it's a concept, it's an attitude towards people, towards things. It's not easy. It's so hard to put this into play. Continuing in verse 27, what sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but filled on the inside with dead people's bones and all sorts of impurities.
Yes, sir.
Outwardly, you look like religious people,
Mhm.
but inwardly, your hearts are filled with hypocrisy and lawlessness.
Yes, sir.
Our goal is not to be that way. And what typically will happen is our mental process will define for us that that's not us. That's the next person. That sentence.
Mhm.
Outwardly, you look like righteous people, but inwardly, your hearts are filled with hypocrisy and lawlessness. We in our minds go, as we're sitting, that's not me, though. You're right, but that's not me. And then that's the problem. That mentally, you're saying this back, and as I'm speaking, it is you.
Mhm.
It doesn't take an hour for me to stand here to convince the audience that we're supposed to obey God,
Mhm.
that we are supposed to do what God says. That doesn't take an hour and plus time to do. I mean, obey God,
Yes, sir.
and now I can sit down. But it does take an hour to get us to understand that this is referring to us.
That's right.
It takes an hour. that I'm talking about you.
Amen.
Right. Talk about us.
And the same thing is being said to me as I speak.
That's right.
This is the hard part. In Amos chapter 5, verse 21, God is speaking to the northern tribe of Israel, and he would be speaking to us today. He's criticizing religious observance instead of internalizing it and following God. The religious observance that he's criticizing in terms of criticizing northern Israel, in this case, he's not talking about true Sabbaths and true holy days, because northern Israel wasn't doing that. They were keeping false days, much like what we would call some of the pagan days, the Christmas, Easter, the Halloweens. That's what they were doing at the time, and God is criticizing that, those festivals and those days. He's not criticizing the righteous sacrifices, because they weren't doing that properly either. They were detached from Judah in Jerusalem, so they weren't going down to the temple to offer sacrifices. They were doing it in places that weren't authorized, that God said, don't do it that way. So they were off to begin with. But God is still saying, on the whole, these acts of religion, that's not what I want. I want you to change internally. Amos chapter 5, verse 21, I despise your feast days, which for northern Israel, they were pagan days. And even for those that would try to do things the right way, to do that on the surface and not internalize the changes that God was looking for was a waste of time. Continuing on, and I do not savor your sacred assemblies. When they got together for church, if they weren't going to change them internally, though you offer me burnt offerings and your grain offerings, I will not accept them. Nor will I regard your fat and peace offerings. Take away from me the noise of your songs when they worship God and they sing hymns. For I will not hear the melody of your stringed instruments. Meaning all of that stuff is not working. But let justice run down like water.
Yes, sir.
And righteousness like a mighty stream.
Amen.
This water that runs is continuous. It's constantly moving. And again, sometimes these Bible verses get lost in us. Because what's the value of a running stream? We got plumbing. We don't understand that. How does a running stream play in our daily life? To them, that made the world run. That made it so that they could fuel or water their crops. That made it so that barnyard fan would turn and you grind their grain. We just go to the store, we're good. So, God is saying, when you follow him internally, that's like a store that's open with 50% off sales. Buy one, get one free. When you buy in bulk, you get the bulk cereals. For $2, you know how expensive cereal is? That's what God is saying. God is saying when you go and you get that juice, the 64 ounce, $1.99, not $6. Food makes it so that you could live life. That analogy makes sense. The store is open. That's what that running water is. 24 hours the store is open. God is saying, you got the hookup, you're going to get the iPhone 11, $50. $50 iPhone 11, full service. You get free Wi-Fi, free everything. Can you relate? That's the mighty stream that God is speaking of. And that's how important it is to internalize, according to this analogy. I got a thing for House of Pancakes. And anyone that knows me know I have a thing for House of Pancakes. And even at work, I like House of Pancakes. And whoever I know, and I don't even have to know you well, I'm like, yo, let's go to House of Pancakes. And usually the response is no, I don't want to go to House of Pancakes. Typically people don't like it as much as I do. And maybe if I get somebody to go, next week I'm going, yo, let's go to House of Pancakes. I went with you last week. So this happens all the time. There was an occasion a while ago where I was at work, And I asked a coworker, yo, let's go to House of Pancakes. And they were like, okay. All right, bet. So we went to House of Pancakes. And we went to House of Pancakes, and I ordered up a storm. I got the 6-stack. I got turkey bacon, turkey sausage, all in one, and this is just my food, not theirs, mine.
Okay.
And it was on. And the waitress, she would come by, as waitresses do, they check on you. And she came by, the waitress, and checked in on us and says, everything okay? Any problems? All right, here's the napkins. She put the napkins on the table, she walks away. A couple of minutes later, she comes back again. Everything okay? Yes. Any problems? Here's the napkins. She puts the napkins on the table. She walks away. A couple of minutes later, she comes back again. Everything all right? Yes. Okay, here's some napkins. Puts the napkins on the table, she walks away. This was beginning to get neurotic. And it was happening that frequently. And the napkins really were building up. We had a stack of napkins. And it was getting a little spooky. It's like, yo, what's this girl's problem? Sure enough, she came back again. Everything all right? Yeah, here's some napkins. The other person, they were laughing. They thought it was funny. I'm like, what's going on? And then it became clear what was happening. She was new. She didn't know how to be a waitress. And all she could do was the appearance of being a waitress and carry out what she thought a waitress would do and disregard all the other capabilities that a waitress would need to display. And so all she could do was, here's some napkins. She couldn't do anything else. She jacked up the bill, by the way, in my favor. And I watched the supervisor chew her out. And I mentioned how much I ordered. She couldn't do that. All she could do, here's some napkins. She couldn't really tell you what the menu was or what was good and what wasn't good. What else they offered? No. She didn't have that capability. Her skill set was not there. All she could do, here's some napkins. Internally, she was not a waitress. Externally, she was trying with, here's some napkins. Do we do the same thing? We don't internalize what is really required of us as a true Christian, as a true follower of God. Can we really do what God asks of us, even though it is complex? Even though it is complicated? Can you? On the inside. Because nobody's watching you when you go home.
True.
No one knows what you're doing on the inside of your brain. Those problems and difficulties that are going on, no one else is going to see. So you'll come back next Saturday and everyone else will think that, wow, you're the greatest. You love God. You're just doing everything right. Whatever other task you might contribute to, setting up, bringing things, talking to others, fellowship, doesn't that sound so like godly? We don't talk, we don't comment, we fellowship. And so you feel so close to God. But are you actually going, here's some napkins? In so doing, if you're not doing everything else that you're supposed to, then you're really going, here's some napkins.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the Pharisee, he's praying and he looks over and he says, I'm glad that I am not like that tax gatherer. Here's some napkins. I fast twice a week. Here's some napkins. I tithe everything that I get. Here's some napkins. I can see the plank in my brother's eye. Here's some napkins. But can we see the plank in our own eye? Do we make that change in ourselves? John chapter 4, verse 21. Christ is speaking to the woman at the well,
Yes.
Samaritan woman.
Yes.
And their conversation begins to come up with the same themes that we're discussing. They begin to talk about the simple and the complex. They begin to talk about the external and the internal. They talk about appearances and how things are to be on the inside. Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father." The woman had posed to him a question: where's the right place to worship? Because the two groups had been at odds over that.
Yes.
The Samaritans, they had similarities in the days and things that they kept because the cultures in the past had kind of overlapped. But the Samaritans did their own thing. They worshiped in their own area. They had their own church, their own temple in Samaria, not in Jerusalem. And so the question often came up between the two groups: where are you really supposed to worship? And that's what she asked Christ. And Christ began to answer her, the time is coming where it's not about, the emphasis will not be about where you worship, even though you're wrong. That was his answer. Even though you're wrong, that's not what the emphasis is going to be. It's not going to be about the external, about the address of where you show up.
That's right.
It's going to be about the internal, about what you're supposed to be doing on the inside. It's not about how you get to temple and then you start to worship. It's about how you worship before you even leave your house. You worship before you even make it to temple by addressing the complexities of the internal part.
That's right.
That begins with prayer, study, fasting, application, and repeating that process. That will change your mind, reform your mind in the way you think and act. And honestly, that's not very sexy. It's not sexy, the part that goes on in the inside. Nobody sees that. You don't get to show that off. But God sees it. But nobody else does. You don't get to hold up the Bible and flip through it. Doesn't that look cool when the preachers on TV do that? They got that crisp Bible and they got the nice suit and they hold it open and they look so religious. But internally, are they changing, or is that just simply here's some napkins? We're tasked to change on the inside. And again, that's the hard part. When we leave here today, are we going to be able to do that? You can try, and if you don't use God to do it, it won't work. And it sounds religious when people say that. But you really do have to pray. If you're not good at it, just keep trying. It's like driving. You might get better at it because you have to. You don't have a choice. Study, same thing. Are you exposing yourself to things of God? Do you read the Bible? Do you listen to other things to try to get more knowledge about God? Or are you just keeping up with television? Are you trying to find out what happens in the next episode of Empire, Power, or whatever other show you're watching? Okay, you downloaded Disney Plus, great. You watching all those shows? Cool. But you got to take the time to understand the things of God, else you're not going to be able to do it when you do try. It won't work because you can't do this on your own power.
Amen.
The music we listen to, you could download all of that. It is not the same. It won't bring you to that understanding. It'll move you, but not internally, to give you the ability that you need in order to do this. Christ continues, you worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, referring to the Jews in that. He's telling her, yeah, that's not the focus, but you were wrong to begin with. But now, we're starting over. We got a new thing going on. Try it this way. But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth.
Yes, sir.
You need God's Spirit in order to affect your mind to carry out this way of thinking. In order to get God's Spirit, you have to do some of these spiritual type interactions,
Amen.
which would be prayer, study, and applying it and repeating that process. If you don't do that, none of this will work.
Amen.
Does it take an hour to get the audience to understand that it's important to pray? No, it does not. Does it take an hour to get the audience to understand that it's important to expose yourself to the things of God in terms of study or listening to other instruction. No, it doesn't. It doesn't take an hour to understand that you're supposed to really try hard to obey what God says. No, because then all you would have to do is just simply go, everybody, you got to go home and pray. You got to study. You got to apply it and keep doing it. That took all a couple of seconds. I should be able to sit down now. But it does take an hour to get you to go home and do it. And usually you don't. To get you to go home and do it when probably when you leave here you won't. Because you're going to get distracted. There's something else to do. You got to eat. You got to do this. You got to do that. Maybe you go to the movies afterwards. What time the movies start? There's always something to do that seems to be more important. And in so doing, the emphasis is not just on doing that, because now you're taking some napkins again. And all you're doing is seeming like you're a good person. The emphasis is on what happens on the inside. But remember that stuff that happens on the inside won't happen unless you do that.
Amen.
You're not showing up here today just because it looks cool. You're showing up so you could do that. If you just show up and don't do it, it doesn't count.
Amen.
That's why you're showing up here today. That's why you pray. That's why you study. That's why you apply this. That's why you repeat it.
Right on.
So you can do this.
Right on.
God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth.
Amen.
This is a requirement.
That's right.
Else nothing will work. 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Paul explains, for though we walk in the flesh, though we live life in this body and we walk around day to day in a physical world, we do not war according to the flesh. Our problems, our issues, is not all about dealing simply with another person. On the surface, it may seem that way. But the issues pertain to how you think within your mind. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds. And,
Yes, sir.
and there the confusion begins. It sounds religious to say strongholds. Casting down arguments and every high thing. Paul is talking about the things that go on in your mind. And sometimes the different translations don't always carry that out. And so you hear these words with strongholds and casting down arguments. He's talking about the approaches in your mind, your mindset. Those are the strongholds. Because that's the hard part. That's the complexity. That's the complex part. That's the stronghold. That's what you have to overcome in your mind. That's how you have to use God's Spirit. Casting down arguments, the arguments in your head, where you go, I'm not doing that, the way Jonah did. When you go, I'm not doing that when you're dealing with your ex-husband, I'm not doing that. For whatever reason, something comes up. Yeah, I'm not doing that. How many times you hung up on your husband or your ex-husband? How many times have you hung up on your husband? How many times have you hung up on your wife or your ex-wife? That's classic. Picking up the phone on it. That's like standard. And it's not that big a deal, but then it can infuriate you when you're on the other end to be hung up on. These are the strongholds and the casting down arguments that Paul is talking about. That exchange. Because your attitude is, they're the ones that's wrong. They're the ones they've done me wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Something's not right. And this is why I take this attitude. That's why I'm not doing that. I'm not dealing with him. I'm not dealing with that problem. I'm not dealing with her. We do this every day. This is life. But this is the Christian walk. This is the challenge. That's the complex part. That's why we're here today. So that we can do that, what I just described. So whether the person that we're having that challenge with is sitting next to us, whether they're at home or at work, it doesn't matter, because if it's not them, it'll be somebody else. When you look at the Bible is filled with these types of problems. These are the things that the people were tasked with. When you look at the Old Testament and you look at the problems they went through, you look at Abraham and his problems at home. You look at Isaac and his problems. He had lady problems. One lady he liked more than the other. And how much of us want recognition from significant others, from our husbands, from our wives? They have problems. And yet he had God's Spirit. He had to work through this the same way we do in our everyday life. Moses had problems, his family. He had issues in the way he related. He had problems with his temper.
Yes, sir.
Moses caught a case. Moses had a warrant. And he ran. He had the typical problems that we all have today. Paul had problems with John Mark. Said he was a bum. I don't want him traveling with us. And he and Barnabas and Mark, they split ways because of it. Paul had problems with Peter.
Yeah.
Peter wanted to act a certain way when he was around Gentiles, but then when the other Jews came, now he acting funny. Racial profiling didn't start today.
No, sir.
Paul called them out. Problems just like today. And these people have God's Spirit,
Yes, they do.
and they're going through this. David had problems. His whole family was messed up.
Okay.
His kids were acting up. You think it's bad enough your kid want to use the car. You're worried about your kid drinking the way he should. Is he smoking weed? And if he is, what's in the weed? Are they running around with girls? Are they doing things they shouldn't be doing? In the back of your head, you're going, I don't want to be the right parent. Are they doing things they shouldn't be doing? Are they around the wrong type of people? And you worry about that. David's family was off the chain. And his kids, they're rebelling and starting civil wars. There was all sorts of problems with rape and other things in his family.
Yes.
He had philandering issues. Papa was a rolling soul. He had that issue too. Why must I chase the cat? The excuse is nothing but the dog in me. And therefore, it's not my fault, it's not my problem. But we need to use God's Spirit to change the dog in all of us.
Yes, sir.
So that we behave differently.
Amen.
These problems were not limited to their world. These problems were people that had God's Spirit, and they were challenged to do the very same things we're challenged to. They could not just do enough with just showing up to church. It wouldn't work. There would be no story for you to read had they done that. David could not just put on a crown and be like, all right, I'm king. It's not enough. In the same way with us. Who's to say there won't be stories written about us in the future world?
Yes, very good.
And so, we have to internalize this and follow through with it. And so, the weapons of our warfare, they're not human. It's a spirit thing.
Yes, sir.
And to do spirit stuff, you got to go to spirit resources and use them.
Amen.
You have to pray, you have to study, you
Amen.
have to apply it, and you have to repeat it. For the weapons, continuing in verse 4, of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God, for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments, and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. And remember, he's referring to things in one's mind, that opposition in your mindset, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. This is what is necessary. So, out of all those problems that I mentioned in the Old Testament, which one of those problems do you have?
Yes, sir. Good question.
Do you just have some of them? Maybe you have all of them.
Maybe.
It happens. Problems come in all different types of sizes. And it still requires us to use God's Spirit to make those changes. Galatians 5, verse 16. So I say, let the Holy Spirit guide your lives. Then you won't be doing what your sinful nature craves. The sinful nature wants to do evil, which is just the opposite of what the Spirit wants. And we all can relate to this because we're all feeling it and going through it and dealing with the same pulls. Continuing on, and the Spirit gives us desires that are the opposite of what the sinful nature desires. These two forces are constantly fighting each other,
Yes,
so you
sir.
are not free to carry out your good intentions. This is the struggle we deal with, but we have to put it into work and into practice. And so, continuing in verse 18, but when you are directed by the Spirit, you are not under the obligation of the law of Moses, or rather, that penalty of sin. We're going to follow through with this, but it still requires effort.
Yes, sir.
Amen.
And it still is not easy. Verse 19, when you follow the desires of your sinful nature, the results are very clear. Sexual immorality, impurity, lustful pleasures, idolatry, sorcery, using drugs, hostility, quarreling, jealousy, outburst of anger, selfish ambition, dissension, division, envy, drunkenness, wild parties, and other sins like these. The party is not wrong, just have a party, but sometimes it can get out of hand.
Yes.
And so the way we live, when we give into the extremes of not following God, we see these displays. But we're supposed to focus on those inward changes where, if done right, you don't get that extreme in sinfulness. We're supposed to go to the extreme of employing that change in the way that we think and using God's Spirit, the extreme of having His mentality and His attitude in our interactions. Continuing on, Paul says, let me tell you again, as I have before, that anyone living that sort of life will not inherit the kingdom of God.
Amen.
But the Holy Spirit produces this kind of fruit in our lives: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. There is no law against these.
Amen.
Doesn't that sound so pretty? It sounds so lovely. But that doesn't work, does it? You read the papers, is that the fix to the problems that we see? Does that fix? One of you guys pick one of our problems in your own lives. Pick a problem with your husband, your ex-husband, your wife, your ex-wife, and throw out this and tell me in your mind, do you think that'll work? Problem at school, problem at home, somebody you like, somebody that doesn't like you, problem with the bills, problem with your attitude, problem with how God just doesn't seem to respond to you or answer your prayers. Whatever your problem is, love, joy, and peace. Does it work now? Problem solved? In your mind, did that just fix it? Probably not. So what am I saying?
Right on.
What I'm saying is, on the surface, externally, without using God's Spirit, it doesn't make sense. It won't work. It won't fix your problems like that. But internally, in your character, changes will come. But when you're fixated in the things in this world, that's not the first change you were looking for. You probably wanted some absolute change that was more physical in this world so that your issue would be resolved. So you think. So maybe you wanted those bills paid or whatever issue you may be having gone. Maybe you wanted things to be a little bit smoother in your relationship. Your kid to stop acting like that. Your coworker or relative to stop being such a butthead. That's what you wanted. Love, joy, and peace. What's that? But that's what's necessary, the internal part. That's why we're here. That's what you got sold when you got baptized. That's what you bought into. And you were like, yeah, I want that.
Yes, sir.
And then you go through it and things don't seem so simple and they become complex. And you start going, well, that wasn't in the fine print. Where's all the other stuff? It's complex. It isn't always simple. But this is necessary: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. When you do try, and you do pray, and you do study, and you do fast, and you do apply this, and you do repeat this, after a while, you won't know it. This stuff will start to show, and you probably won't even recognize it. When I was a kid learning how to ride a bike, it was so annoying because I couldn't seem to get it right. But at least I had training wheels. So I would rock the training wheels and I could ride. And it got to a point where my pops was like, all right, that's enough. Off with the training wheels. Well, now it wasn't enjoyable. I can't ride now because I couldn't stay balanced. That's no fun. I wanted the training wheels on so it could look like I could ride. So it would appear like I could ride. Give me the training wheels, here's some napkins. So my father would try to teach me how to ride, my biological father. And I would ride this bike and he would hold the back of the bike. And I would ride and he would run along behind the bike and I would ride that way. Fine, I was cool with that. I didn't care. I got to ride. One day I was doing this, he's holding the back of the bike and I'm riding. We were in a park, in Brooklyn actually. Prospect Park, I think. We were on the street, one of those long park lanes. And he's holding the bike and I'm riding. I'm talking. I thought we were having a conversation. And I'm speaking to him, and he's not answering me. I appreciate that. So I'm writing, and I turn around to ask, like, what's up? Why are you not answering me? And my father was all the way down the block, nowhere near me. And then I fell. My point is, sometimes it looks like it's not working, and it actually is. And when it is working, you will not notice it.
Yes, sir. That's right.
And so what we are to do is just focus on what we're supposed to do.
That's
Because if you can't notice it in yourself, you're not going to notice it in the guy next to you.
Amen.
So don't focus on what they're doing and go, I'm better than him. I'm not doing that. I'm not having that problem. Here's some napkins. Don't do that. Focus on yourself and change in yourself using God's Spirit.
Amen.
Philippians 4 verse 13 says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens
That's
me.
right.
It's certainly a mantra that people shout out in religious programming and in religious thinking, but it's true, and we are to apply it. Matthew 22 verse 36, Christ is speaking, and there's an exchange where someone comes to him and says, Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Christ replies to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself.
Amen.
On the one hand, that seems so simple, but when you try to put it into play, it's so complex. We have to use God's Spirit in order to do that. And remember, this is what must be done in our obedience and worship of God,
Yes.
not just showing up at church. And this is what we do 24 hours a day, starting now and continuing on.